In Hercule Poirot and the Case of Confession, That Lied. Chapter 1. The whispered admission the village of Thornwick, nestled in the gentle folds of the Sussex countryside, was precisely the sort of place where one might expect nothing to happen. Cobbled lanes lined with ivy-clad cottages and its ancient church, with a spire that pierced the mist like a needle, exuded an air of timeless tranquillity. Yet, as Hercule Poirot had often observed, it was in such quiet corners of the world that the human heart concealed its most turbulent secrets. Poirot had come to Thornwick for a respite, or so he told himself. The ceaseless bustle of London, with its clamorous demands on his little grey cells, had prompted his old friend Captain Hastings to recommend a week of rural repose. "A place to sip tea and admire the roses, Poirot," Hastings had said with his characteristic optimism, and so Poirot found himself installed at the Blackthorn Inn, a charming establishment with creaking floorboards and a fireplace that roared with unnecessary vigour for an early autumn evening. It was on the second evening of his stay, as he sat in the inn's cosy parlour, that the first ripple of intrigue disturbed the placid surface of his holiday. Poirot, ever the observer, had positioned himself in a high-backed armchair near the window, a cup of tisane balanced delicately on his knee. His moustache, immaculately waxed, twitched slightly as he surveyed the room. The inn's patrons, a handful of locals and a travelling salesman, chatted in low murmurs, their voices blending with the crackle of the fire. But it was a conversation at a corner table that drew his attention, like a magnet pulling at the needle of his curiosity. Two women sat there, their heads bent close together. One was young, perhaps no more than 25, with a pale heart-shaped face framed by dark curls that escaped her bonnet. Her hands, clasped tightly on the table, betrayed a nervous energy. The other, older and stouter, wore the practical attire of a village matron, her expression one of mingled concern and exasperation. Poirot, with his uncanny knack for hearing what others overlooked, caught fragments of their exchange. "Clara, you must tell someone," the older woman urged, her voice low but insistent. "You cannot carry this alone." The younger woman, Clara, presumably, shook her head vehemently. "I can't, Mrs. Langley. You don't understand. If I speak, it will ruin everything. But I did it. I swear. It was me." Poirot's fingers tightened imperceptibly around his cup. The words were vague, yet their weight was unmistakable. A confession, or the shadow of one, hung in the air. He leaned forward slightly, his green eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat. Clara's voice dropped to a whisper, but Poirot's sharp ears caught the tremble in it. "It was a terrible act," she said, her words barely audible. "I'll never forgive myself, but I had no choice." Mrs. Langley reached across the table, gripping Clara's wrist. "Hush, child, not here. Walls have ears in Thornwick." Poirot permitted himself a small private smile. Walls, perhaps, did not have ears, but Hercule Poirot most certainly did. He sipped his tisane, his mind already turning over the possibilities. A terrible act could mean many things: a theft, a betrayal, or something far darker. Clara's fear, her reluctance to elaborate, suggested a secret of considerable gravity. And yet there was something in her tone, a flicker of hesitation, that made Poirot wonder if her confession was entirely truthful. The conversation ended abruptly, as Clara rose, pulling her shawl tightly around her shoulders. "I must go," she murmured. "Please don't tell anyone, not yet." Mrs. Langley nodded, though her face was troubled. Clara hurried out of the parlour, her footsteps echoing on the wooden stairs. Poirot watched her departure through the window, noting the way she glanced nervously over her shoulder as she stepped into the twilight. A young woman in distress, he thought, but whether she was victim, culprit, or both, he could not yet say. He turned his attention to Mrs. Langley, who remained at the table staring into her untouched tea. Poirot rose with the grace of a cat and approached, his manner as polished as ever. "Pardon, madam," he said, bowing slightly. "I could not help but observe that you are troubled. Permit me to introduce myself, Hercule Poirot, at your service." Mrs. Langley started, her eyes widening. "Oh, Mr. Poirot, is it? I've heard of you, sir. They say you're a detective, the cleverest in all of England." Poirot inclined his head modestly. "They say many things, madam, but I am here merely to enjoy the peace of Thornwick. Tell me, if it is not indiscreet, who was the young lady with whom you spoke? She seemed most distressed." Mrs. Langley hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. "That was Clara Dunley, sir. A good girl, but, well, she's got herself into some sort of trouble, I fear. I shouldn't say more. It's not my place." Of course," Poirot said smoothly, his tone soothing. "I would not dream of pressing you. But if Mademoiselle Dunley is in need of assistance, you may tell her that Hercule Poirot is never far away." Mrs. Langley managed a weak smile. "You're kind, sir. I'll tell her, though I doubt she'll speak to anyone. She's stubborn, that one." Poirot returned to his seat, his mind alight with questions. Clara Dunley's confession, however vague, was the spark that had ignited his interest. A terrible act, she had said. But what act? And why confess to Mrs. Langley, only to beg for silence? There was a puzzle here, and Poirot, despite his supposed holiday, could not resist the lure of a puzzle. As the evening wore on, the inn grew quieter, the fire dying to embers. Poirot remained in his chair, his eyes half closed, but his thoughts were far from idle. He considered the village of Thornwick, with its picturesque facade and hidden currents. He thought of Clara Dunley, her pale face and trembling hands, and he wondered, with the faintest thrill of anticipation, what secrets lay beneath the surface of this tranquil place. Tomorrow, he decided, he would take a walk through the village. He would observe, he would listen, and he would begin to unravel the mystery of the whispered admission. For Hercule Poirot knew, as surely as he knew the perfection of a well-waxed moustache, that no confession, no matter how heartfelt, could hide the truth. Chapter 2. The Shadow of Doubt. The morning sun cast a golden haze over Thornwick, gilding the rooftops and softening the edges of the village's ancient stone walls. To the casual observer, it was a scene of pastoral perfection, but Hercule Poirot, strolling along the cobbled lane with his ebony cane tapping a precise rhythm, saw beyond the picturesque. He saw the furtive glances of passers-by, the hushed whispers that ceased as he approached, and the faint air of unease that clung to the village like damp mist. Thornwick, he concluded, was a place with secrets, and secrets were the lifeblood of a detective's work. Poirot's destination was the village post office. a cramped establishment that doubled as a hub of local gossip. His inquiries, he knew, must be subtle. A direct approach would only close the lips of these reticent villagers. As he entered, the bell above the door jingled, and a stout woman behind the counter looked up from sorting letters. Her eyes, sharp and inquisitive, assessed him with the wariness of one accustomed to sizing up strangers. "Bonjour, madame," Poirot said, removing his hat with a flourish. "I am Hercule Poirot, a visitor to your charming village. I seek only to post a letter. But perhaps you, Krieger, was a guest user of the local post office." But Poirot's purpose was far from mundane. He sought information, and the postmistress, Mrs. Agnes Tuttle, was known to be a font of village lore. Mrs. Tuttle, flattered by Poirot's polished manners, was soon persuaded to chat. "A terrible shame about Mr. Hawthorne," she said, shaking her head as she stamped Poirot's letter. "Found dead in his study, not 2 weeks ago. The doctor said it was his heart, but, well, folk have their doubts." Poirot's moustache twitched with interest. "Doubts, madame? Pray, what do you mean?" Mrs. Tuttle leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Mr. Hawthorne was a hard man, sir. Made enemies, he did. Some say he was poisoned, though the police found nothing amiss. And then there's Miss Clara Dunlay, acting so queer since it happened. She was seen near the manor that night, you know." Poirot's pulse quickened, though his expression remained impassive. Clara Dunlay, the young woman whose whispered confession had so intrigued him, was now linked to a suspicious death. "Most curious," he murmured. "And what sort of man was this Mr. Hawthorne?" "A tyrant," Mrs. Tuttle replied, her lips pursing. "Owned half the land round here, and never let anyone forget it. His son, young Edmund, hadn't spoken to him in years. Then there's Mrs. Grange, his housekeeper, who swore she'd never forgive him for some slight. And Mr. Vickers the brewer was furious over a land deal gone sour. Oh, there's no shortage of folk glad he's gone." Poirot filed these names away, his mind already sorting them into categories of motive and opportunity. "And the official report? It claims natural causes?" "Aye, heart failure," Mrs. Tuttle said. "But Dr. Pritchard's no genius, if you ask me. Did a quick look and called it done. No autopsy, no fuss. The family didn't push for one either." This was a wrinkle Poirot had not anticipated, a death declared natural without thorough investigation. It was either gross incompetence or a deliberate oversight. He thanked Mrs. Tuttle warmly and stepped back into the sunlight, his thoughts whirling. Clara's confession, vague though it was, now took on a darker hue. Had she spoken of murder? And if so, was her terrible act the deed itself, or something else entirely? Determined to learn more, Poirot made his way to Thornwick Manor, the late Reginald Hawthorne's residence. The manor stood at the edge of the village, a brooding pile of grey stone, half swallowed by ivy. Its windows glared down like unblinking eyes, and the air around it seemed heavier, as though the house itself mourned its master. Poirot rang the bell, and after a moment the door creaked open to reveal a wiry woman in her 50s, her face etched with fatigue. This, he deduced, was Mrs. Edith Grange, the housekeeper. "Mr. Poirot?" she said, eyeing him warily. "Mrs. Langley said you might call. I've no time for visitors, mind, but if you're quick." Poirot offered his most disarming smile. "Madam, I shall be as brief as precision allows. I am merely curious about the late Mr. Hawthorne. His passing has caused much talk, and I wish to understand the truth. Mrs. Grange ushered him into a dim parlour, its furniture shrouded in dust sheets. "Truth," she said, her tone bitter. "The truth is, Mr. Hawthorne was a cruel man who got what he deserved. But if you're asking whether he was murdered, I'll tell you what I told the police. He was alone in his study, locked from the inside, when he died. No poison, no wounds, nothing. Just a dead man and a cold cup of tea." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Locked from the inside, you say? Most intriguing. And you saw nothing unusual that evening?" Mrs. Grange hesitated, her fingers twisting the hem of her apron. I heard voices earlier that day. Mr. Hawthorne arguing with someone. Couldn't make out who. And later I saw Miss Clara near the gate, looking frightened. But she's a sweet girl, Mr. Poirot. She'd not harm a fly." Poirot nodded, though his mind was far from settled. A locked room, a heated argument, and Clara Dunley's presence near the scene. These were pieces of a puzzle, but the picture remained elusive. He thanked Mrs. Grange and took his leave, pausing on the manor's steps to survey the grounds. The garden, overgrown and wild, stretched toward a copse of trees, and beyond it the church spire pierced the sky. Somewhere in this village, he knew, lay the key to Clara's confession, and to the shadow of doubt that now cloaked Reginald Hawthorne's death. As he walked back toward the inn, Poirot's thoughts turned to the villagers Mrs. Tuttle had named: Edmund Hawthorne, the estranged son; Mrs. Grange, the resentful housekeeper; and Mr. Vickers, the cheated brewer. Each had reason to wish Hawthorne dead, yet Clara's words, "It was a terrible act," echoed loudest in his mind. Was she the culprit, or merely a pawn in a larger game? And why had the investigation been so cursory? By the time he reached the Whodunit Blackthorn Inn, Poirot's holiday was forgotten. His little grey cells hummed with purpose, for he sensed that Thornwick's tranquil facade concealed a truth as sharp and deadly as a hidden blade. Tomorrow, he resolved, he would seek out Clara Dunley herself. The shadow of doubt had fallen, and Hercule Poirot would not rest until he had dragged the truth. Chapter 3. The Mask of Motive. The morning mist hung low over Thornwick, shrouding the village in a veil of silver that softened its edges but did little to dispel the undercurrent of unease. Hercule Poirot, impeccable in his tailored overcoat and polished shoes, walked purposefully toward the modest cottage where Clara Dunley resided. His cane tapped a steady rhythm on the dew-slick cobbles, a counterpoint to the rapid calculations of his little grey cells. Clara's whispered confession, overheard at the Blackthorn Inn, and her reported presence near Thornwick Manor on the night of Reginald Hawthorne's death, had elevated her to the forefront of his inquiries. Today he would speak with her directly, and Hercule Poirot was not a man to be easily deceived. The cottage, a quaint structure with a sagging thatched roof and roses climbing its walls, stood at the village's edge, where the lane gave way to open fields. Poirot knocked, and after a moment the door opened to reveal Clara Dunley herself. Her pale face, framed by dark curls, was drawn with fatigue, and her eyes, large and shadowed, darted nervously past him, as though expecting an unseen pursuer. She wore a simple grey dress, its hem frayed, and her hands clutched a handkerchief, as if it were a lifeline. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "Mrs. Langley said you wished to see me. I don't know what I can tell you." Poirot removed his hat and bowed slightly, his manner as courteous as if he were addressing royalty. "Mademoiselle Dunley, I am but a visitor in Thornwick, yet I find myself troubled by certain matters. You are, I believe, a young lady of good heart, and I wish only to understand. May I come in?" Clara hesitated, then stepped aside, gesturing toward a small parlour furnished with faded chintz and a single vase of wilted flowers. Poirot seated himself, his posture erect, and observed her as she perched on the edge of a chair, her fingers twisting the handkerchief into knots. The room, though tidy, bore signs of neglect. A cracked teacup on the mantel, a rug worn thin at the centre. Poverty, Poirot noted, or perhaps preoccupation. "Mademoiselle," he began, his tone gentle but probing, "I have heard of the sad passing of Monsieur Hawthorne, and I have heard, too, of your distress. You spoke to Mrs. Langley of a terrible act. I ask you now, as one who seeks only the truth, what did you mean?" Clara's eyes widened, and a flush crept into her cheeks. "You heard that? Oh, I should never have spoken. It was a mistake, Monsieur Poirot. I was upset, confused. I didn't mean—" "Calm yourself, mademoiselle," Poirot interjected, raising a hand. "I do not accuse, I observe. You said you had no choice, that you did something unforgivable. If you are in trouble, perhaps I can help, but I must know the truth." Clara's gaze dropped to her lap, and for a long moment she was silent. When she spoke, her voice trembled. "Mr. Hawthorne, he was not a kind man. He hurt people I care about. I did something to stop him, but I can't say more. Please, don't ask me to." Poirot's green eyes narrowed, though. His expression remained serene. Her words were vague, yet they confirmed a connection to Hawthorne, one laced with animosity. Was it personal, he wondered, or tied to another? He decided to press gently. "Mademoiselle, you were seen near Thornwick Manor the night he died. Can you tell me why?" Clara flinched as though struck. I went to speak with him, to beg him to reconsider something, but he was already dead when I arrived. I swear it." Poirot noted the desperation in her tone, the way her hands shook. She was hiding something, but whether it was guilt or fear, he could not yet determine. "Very well," he said, rising. "I will not trouble you further today. But know this, Mademoiselle Dunley, the truth, it has a way of revealing itself, and Hercule Poirot is its most faithful servant." As he left the cottage, Poirot's mind churned. Clara's partial admission suggested a motive, perhaps vengeance or protection, of another. But her claim of finding Hawthorne already dead contradicted the timeline Mrs. Grange had provided. Someone, he suspected, was not telling the whole truth. His next stop was the village square, where he sought out the other figures Mrs. Tuttle had named as potential enemies of Reginald Hawthorne. First, he encountered Edmund Hawthorne, the late landowner's estranged son, lounging outside the local pub. Edmund was a lanky man in his 30s, with a sullen air and eyes that glinted with suppressed anger. His coat was patched, his boots scuffed, a stark contrast to his father's wealth. "Monsieur Hawthorne," Poirot greeted, tipping his hat. "I am Hercule Poirot, investigating certain irregularities surrounding your father's death. May I ask when you last saw him?" Edmund's lip curled. "Investigating, are you? Well, I'll save you the trouble. I hadn't seen the old man in years, not since he cut me off for marrying against his wishes. I was in London when he died. Ask anyone." Poirot smiled thinly. "And yet you are here now. The inheritance, perhaps it brings you back." Edmund's face darkened. "I don't want his money. I came to see justice done, nothing more." The words were bold, but Poirot detected a flicker of unease in Edmund's posture. A man with a grudge, he thought, and perhaps a reason to lie. He thanked Edmund and moved on, his attention turning to Mr. Harold Vickers, the brewer whose land deal with Hawthorne had soured. Vickers was found at his brewery, a squat building redolent of malt and yeast. A burly man with a florid complexion, he greeted Poirot with barely concealed impatience. "What's this about Hawthorne?" he demanded, wiping his hands on an apron. "I've no time for nonsense." Poirot's tone was placating. "Monsieur, I understand you had a disagreement with Monsieur Hawthorne over land. Such disputes, they can breed resentment, non?" Vickers snorted. "Resentment? He cheated me plain and simple, promised me that plot by the river, then sold it out from under me. But I didn't kill him, if that's what you're driving at. I was at the brewery all night, with a dozen witnesses." Poirot nodded, his eyes scanning Vickers' face for signs of deceit. The man's anger was genuine, but his alibi, like Edmund's, was conveniently airtight. Too convenient, perhaps. As Poirot returned to the Blackthorn Inn, the threads of the case began to weave together in his mind. Clara Dunlay, with her cryptic confession and nervous demeanour, stood at the centre, but around her orbited others with motives of their own. Edmund, nursing a familial wound, Vickers, cheated in business, and Mrs. Grange, whose bitterness toward her employer had been palpable. Each wore a mask, concealing their true intentions, and Poirot knew that beneath one of those masks lay the truth about Hawthorne's death. Seated in the inn's parlour, Poirot sipped his tisane and reflected. Clara's claim of finding Hawthorne dead intrigued him most. If true, it suggested another hand at work, someone who had acted before her arrival. But if false, it was a lie designed to deflect suspicion. And then there was the locked study, the absence of an autopsy, the voices Mrs. Grange had heard. The pieces were there, but the puzzle was far from complete. Tomorrow, he decided, he would revisit Thornwick Manor. The scene of the crime held secrets yet to be uncovered, and Poirot's little grey cells were eager to unearth them. For now, he watched the firelight dance on the parlour walls, his mind as sharp as ever, slicing through the masks of motive to glimpse the... Chapter 4. The tangled web. The air in Thornwick carried a chill that morning, as though the village itself sensed the gathering storm of secrets about to break. Hercule Poirot, undeterred by the damp breeze, made his way once more to Thornwick Manor, his ebony cane clicking against the gravel path. The manor loomed ahead, its grey stone facade as unyielding as the mysteries it concealed. Poirot's little grey cells were alight with purpose, for Clara Dunlay's halting confession had raised more questions than it answered, and the locked study where Reginald Hawthorne had met his end beckoned like a puzzle box awaiting its key. As he approached, the heavy oak door swung open, revealing Mrs. Edith Grange, the housekeeper, her wiry frame taut with agitation. Her eyes, red-rimmed and wary, met Poirot's with a mixture of resignation and defiance. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice clipped, "I expected you'd return. Best come in, then, but don't expect me to welcome meddling." Poirot inclined his head, his moustache curving in a polite smile. "Madame, I seek only the truth, and you, I believe, are a woman who values honesty. May I see the study where Monsieur Hawthorne was found?" Mrs. Grange hesitated, then led him through the manor's dimly lit corridors, her footsteps echoing on the polished floor. As they walked, she spoke abruptly, as though the words had been festering too long. "I've something to tell you, Monsieur Poirot, since you're so keen on digging. It was me. I killed him." Poirot stopped short, his green eyes narrowing. "You confess, madame. This is most serious. Pray, explain yourself." Mrs. Grange's hands twisted together, her knuckles white. Mr. Hawthorne was a cruel master, always lording his power over us. I put something in his tea that night. A powder from the apothecary. I didn't mean for him to die, only to sleep, to teach him a lesson. But when I checked later, he was gone, locked in that study, dead." Poirot's expression remained impassive, though his mind raced. A second confession, so soon after Clara's, was a complication he had not anticipated. "And why, madam? Do you tell me this now?" "Because I can't bear the guilt," she said, her voice breaking. "And because Clara, poor Miss Dunley, she's taking the blame for something she didn't do. I heard her talking, saying she'd done a terrible thing, but it was me, Monsieur Poirot. I swear it." Poirot studied her closely, noting the tremor in her hands, the way her eyes avoided his. Her story was plausible, yet it clashed with Clara's claim of finding Hawthorne already dead. One of them was lying, or both were weaving a tangled web to obscure the truth. "Very well, madam," he said. "I will consider your words. Now, the study, if you please." Mrs. Grange led him to a heavy door at the end of a corridor, its brass key still in the lock. The study was a sombre room, its walls lined with bookshelves and a massive oak desk dominating the centre. A single window, shuttered tightly, cast the space in gloom. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of old leather and wax. Poirot's eyes swept the room, cataloguing every detail. The leather armchair where Hawthorne had been found, the cold teacup on the desk, the fireplace choked with ash. "Tell me, madame," Poirot said, circling the desk, "what was the state of this room when you discovered the body?" Mrs. Grange fidgeted. "Just as you see it, near enough. The door was locked, the key inside. I had a spare key, so I let myself in after I realized something was wrong. He was slumped in that chair, cold as stone. The doctor came, said it was his heart, and that was that." Poirot nodded, though his attention was elsewhere. He approached the desk, his fingers brushing the edge of a blotter. There, half hidden beneath a stack of papers, was a letter opener, its silver blade gleaming faintly. It was an elegant piece, engraved with a floral motif, but its placement struck him as odd. Why was it buried under papers, when such a tool would typically rest in plain view? He lifted it carefully, noting a faint smudge on the handle. A fingerprint, perhaps, or something more. "Madam," he said, turning to Mrs. Grange, "this letter opener. Was it always kept here beneath these papers? Mrs. Grange frowned, stepping closer. No, it was usually on top, by the inkstand. Mr. Hawthorne was particular about his desk. I hadn't noticed it was moved. Poirot's moustache twitched with satisfaction. A small discrepancy, but in his experience, it was the smallest details that unravelled the greatest lies. He pocketed the letter opener, intending to examine it later, and continued his inspection. The teacup, he noted, bore a faint residue, not unlike the sediment of an undissolved powder. Had Mrs. Grange's powder left its mark, or was this another thread in the web? As he completed his survey, Poirot's thoughts turned to the two confessions. Clara's had been vague, emotional, driven by fear. Mrs. Grange's was precise, almost rehearsed, yet tinged with guilt. Both women claimed responsibility for Hawthorne's death, yet their stories contradicted each other, and the locked room, with its undisturbed appearance, suggested a third possibility, that neither was telling the full truth. "Madam," Poirot said, facing Mrs. Grange, "your confession is noted, but I must ask, did you see Miss Dunley in the Manor that night, as you claimed before?" Mrs. Grange's eyes flickered with uncertainty. I saw her near the gate, as I said, but not inside. I may have been mistaken about the time." Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "The memory, it is a curious thing, no? I thank you for your candour. I will trouble you no further today." As he left the Manor, the letter-opener a reassuring weight in his pocket, Poirot felt the strands of the case tightening. Clara Dunley and Mrs. Grange, each with their confessions, were entangled in a web of deceit. But who had spun it? The misplaced letter-opener, the residue in the teacup, the locked door. These were clues, but they pointed in too many directions. Was Hawthorne's death a murder, as the confessions suggested, or was there another explanation, one hidden in the shadows of Thornwick's secrets? Back at the Blackthorn Inn, Poirot sat by the parlour fire, his tisane untouched as he pondered. The case was no longer a single thread, but a knot, and he would need all his ingenuity to untangle it. Tomorrow, he resolved, he would seek out the village doctor, Dr. Pritchard, to probe the cursory nature of Hawthorne's death report. For now, he closed his eyes, letting his little grey cells weave the clues into a pattern, however incomplete. The tangled web was growing, but Hercule Poirot was a master at finding the thread that... Chapter 5. The Clock That Stopped. The village of Thornwick lay under a sky heavy with clouds, the kind that promised rain but withheld it, as if conspiring to keep the air thick with anticipation. Hercule Poirot, undaunted by the oppressive weather, returned to Thornwick Manor with the precision of a metronome, his polished shoes navigating the muddy path with remarkable grace. The manor's grim silhouette seemed to watch his approach, its windows like eyes guarding secrets. Poirot's mind was fixed on the contradictions of the case. Clara Dunley's fearful confession, Mrs. Grange's calculated admission, and the locked study where Reginald Hawthorne had met his end. Today, he sought answers in the details, for it was in the smallest irregularities that truth often hid. Mrs. Edith Grange greeted him at the door, her face a mask of weary resignation. "Back again, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her tone edged with irritation. You'll wear out the floors with all this poking about." Poirot's moustache curved in a placating smile. "Madam, the floors of Thornwick Manor are sturdy, as is my determination to find the truth. I wish to examine the manor further, with your permission. There are inconsistencies that trouble me." Mrs. Grange sighed and stepped aside, muttering about meddlesome foreigners. Poirot, unperturbed, made his way to the corridor outside, the study where a tall grandfather clock stood sentinel. Its mahogany case was polished to a gleam, but its hands were frozen at 10 minutes past 9, a silent witness to the night of Hawthorne's death. Poirot had noticed it during his previous visit, but now its stillness struck him as significant. A clock of such grandeur would not be left unwound in a household as fastidious as this one. "Madame," he called, beckoning Mrs. Grange, "this clock, it has stopped. When was it last wound?" Mrs. Grange frowned, approaching with reluctant steps. "It's wound every Sunday, regular as church bells. Mr. Hawthorne insisted on it. I haven't touched it since that night. I suppose I forgot, with all the fuss." Poirot's eyes gleamed, and yet it stopped at 10 minutes past 9. Most curious. "Tell me, what was the hour when you discovered Monsieur Hawthorne's body?" Mrs. Grange hesitated, her fingers twisting her apron. "It was near midnight, I think. I'd been in my room, then went to check on him when he didn't answer my knock. That's when I used the spare key." Poirot's mind raced. If the clock had stopped at 10 minutes past 9, and Hawthorne was found dead nearly 3 hours later, the timeline was askew. Clara had claimed to find Hawthorne already dead when she visited, supposedly earlier that evening. Mrs. Grange's confession suggested she poisoned his tea before locking the study. But why would a clock, meticulously maintained, stop at such a precise moment? Had it been deliberately tampered with to mislead, or did it mark a critical event? He turned his attention to the clock's mechanism, opening the panel with care. The weights and pendulum were intact, but the gears were still, as though halted by force. Poirot's fingers brushed a faint scratch on the inner casing, a mark that suggested someone had interfered with the clock's delicate workings. "Mon Dieu," he murmured, "this was no accident." Leaving the clock, Poirot requested to speak with the manor's other staff, hoping to clarify the events of that fateful night. Mrs. Grange summoned Mary, a young maid with a nervous disposition and eyes that darted like a frightened doe's. Mary curtsied awkwardly, her hands smoothing her apron as she faced Poirot in the parlour. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said, his tone gentle but probing, "you were in the manor the night Monsieur Hawthorne died, oui? Tell me what you saw or heard, no matter how small." Ugh, cheeks flushed. I don't know much, sir. I was in the kitchen most of the evening cleaning, but I heard voices around 8 o'clock coming from the study. Mr. Hawthorne was arguing with someone, loud, like. I couldn't make out the words, and I didn't dare go near. Poirot leaned forward, his green eyes sharp. "Voices, you say? And could you tell who this other person was?" Mary shook her head. "No, sir. It was muffled, and I was too far off. But later, maybe 9 or so, I saw someone in the hall, heading toward the back door. I only glimpsed them. A dark coat, moving quick. I thought it was one of the staff, but now I'm not sure." Poirot's moustache twitched with satisfaction. A secret meeting an argument, and a mysterious figure fleeing the manor. These were threads in the tapestry of the crime. But the stopped clock at 10 minutes past 9 suggested something had occurred at that precise moment, something that disrupted the household's rhythm. Had Hawthorne died then, or was the clock a ruse to obscure the true time of death? "Merci, mademoiselle," Poirot said, dismissing Mary with a nod. He turned to Mrs. Grange, who had lingered by the door, her expression unreadable. "Madame, you mentioned hearing voices earlier that day, but not at night. Did you hear nothing around 9 o'clock when the clock stopped?" Mrs. Grange's lips tightened. "I was in my room, as I said. I heard nothing after supper." "The manor's big, Monsieur Poirot. Sound doesn't carry." Poirot smiled thinly, unconvinced. Her confession of poisoning Hawthorne's tea was too neat, her answers too guarded. He suspected she knew more about the night's events than she admitted, perhaps even about the clock's sabotage. But he would not press her now. The truth required patience, like a hunter stalking elusive prey. As he left the manor, Poirot paused by the grandfather clock once more, his fingers tracing the scratch on its casing. The stopped clock was a clue, but its meaning remained elusive. Did it mark the moment of Hawthorne's death, or was it a deliberate act to confuse the timeline? And who was the figure Mary had seen, slipping away into the night? The argument in the study, the stopped clock, and the two conflicting confessions formed a knot that grew tighter with each revelation. Back at the Blackthorn Inn, Poirot sat in his usual armchair, his tisane cooling as he pondered. The letter-opener from the study, the residue in the teacup, and now the stopped clock. These were pieces of a puzzle, but they did not yet fit. Clara Dunley, Mrs. Grange, and the shadowy figure in the dark coat each held a piece of the truth. But which was the key? Tomorrow, he decided, he would seek out Dr. Pritchard again, pressing for details about the medical examination that had so hastily declared Hawthorne's death natural. For now, Poirot closed his eyes, letting his little grey cells work their magic. The clock that stopped had spoken, and its message, though cryptic, was a step toward unravelling the tangled web of thorn. Chapter 6. The Veiled Accusation. The village of Thornwick, with its quaint cottages and ancient church, had always prided itself on its decorum, but beneath its serene surface simmered a cauldron of whispers and judgments. By mid-morning, the air was thick with more than the usual autumn mist. A scandal was brewing, and Hercule Poirot, ever attuned to the pulse of human nature, sensed it as he stepped into the village square. His ebony cane tapped a deliberate rhythm, a counterpoint to the rapid calculations of his little grey cells. The confessions of Clara Dunley and Mrs. Grange, the stopped clock, and the misplaced letter-opener had woven a complex tapestry, and now a new thread threatened to unravel it further. Poirot's destination was the church, where he hoped to speak with Dr. Pritchard, the village doctor, about the cursory examination of Reginald Hawthorne's death. But as he approached the stone archway, he was met by a small crowd gathered outside, their voices buzzing like bees disturbed from their hive. At the centre stood the Reverend Thomas Whitby, Thornwick's vicar, a tall, gaunt man with a face carved in lines of righteous severity. His arms were raised, and his words carried the weight of a sermon, though their tone was far from charitable. "It is our duty to face the truth," the vicar declared, his voice ringing across the square. "Clara Dunley, a daughter of this village, has confessed to a grievous sin. She came to me in confidence, admitting her role in a terrible deed, and I can no longer remain silent. We must protect Thornwick from those who would hide their guilt." The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement, others casting uneasy glances toward the Dunley cottage in the distance. Poirot's moustache twitched with displeasure. A public accusation, and from a man of the cloth. This was no mere indiscretion. It was a calculated act, and Poirot intended to understand its purpose. He pushed through the crowd, his diminutive figure commanding attention despite his stature. "Monsieur le Vicaire," he called, his voice clear and authoritative. "I am Hercule Poirot, a visitor to your village. May I inquire what prompts this outburst? To accuse a young woman so publicly, it is most unusual, no?" The vicar's eyes narrowed, though he maintained his air of piety. "Monsieur Poirot, I have heard of your reputation, but this is a matter of conscience. Miss Dunley confessed to me in the sanctity of the church that she committed a wrong tied to Mr. Hawthorne's death. I urged her to go to the police, but she refused. I cannot in good faith allow such a secret to fester." Poirot's green eyes studied the vicar, noting the slight tremor in his hands, the way his gaze flickered toward the crowd rather than meeting Poirot's directly. A man of conviction, perhaps, but also one with an agenda. "And what, precisely, did Mademoiselle Dunley confess?" Poirot asked, his tone deceptively mild. Reverend Whitby hesitated, as though weighing his words. She spoke of a terrible act of guilt that weighed upon her soul. She would not give details, but her connection to Hawthorne's death is clear. I have a duty to this village, Monsieur Poirot, to ensure justice is done. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and Poirot sensed the tide turning against Clara. He raised a hand, his presence silencing the chatter. "Mes amis," he said, addressing the villagers, "it is unwise to judge without evidence. Mademoiselle Dunley is distressed, oui, but distress is not guilt. I, Hercule Poirot, am investigating the death of Monsieur Hawthorne, and I assure you the truth will be found, not in accusations, but in facts." The villagers exchanged glances, some mollified, others sceptical. Poirot turned back to the vicar. "Monsieur, I would speak with you privately. The church, perhaps?" Reverend Whitby nodded stiffly and led Poirot into the cool, shadowed interior of the church, where the scent of wax and old wood hung heavy. Once alone, Poirot wasted no time. "Monsieur, your accusation is bold, but it lacks precision. What did Mademoiselle Dunley say, exactly? And why choose now to make it public?" The vicar's composure faltered. "She came to me 2 days after Hawthorne's death, weeping, saying she had done something unforgivable. She mentioned his name, said she could never atone. I pressed her, but she fled. I spoke out today because the village is in turmoil, and secrets breed distrust." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And yet you break her confidence, a sacred trust. Tell me, Monsieur Whitby, what was your relationship with Monsieur Hawthorne? A man of his influence surely crossed paths with the church." The vicar stiffened. "Mr. Hawthorne was a parishioner, but not a generous one. He opposed my plans to restore the church roof, called it a waste of funds. We had words, but nothing more. Poirot smiled, thinly unconvinced. The vicar's motives were veiled, but the accusation against Clara served a purpose, perhaps to deflect suspicion or to settle a personal score. He filed this away, his mind returning to the broader puzzle. Clara's confession to the vicar mirrored her words to Mrs. Langley, yet its vagueness suggested she was shielding someone or something, and Mrs. Granger's conflicting claim of poisoning Hawthorne added another layer of deceit. Determined to protect Clara from the village's wrath, Poirot made his way to her cottage. He found her in the garden, her face pale and drawn, her hands trembling as she clutched a pair of pruning shears. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice breaking, "they're saying I killed him. The vicar, he's turned everyone against me." Poirot placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "Mademoiselle, fear not. The mob, it is swayed by emotion, but I am swayed by reason. Tell me, why did you speak to the vicar? What did you say?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I was desperate. I thought he'd understand, being a man of God. I told him I'd done something terrible, that it was my fault Hawthorne suffered, but I didn't kill him, I swear. I only wanted to stop him from hurting someone I love." Poirot's heart softened, but his mind remained sharp. "Someone you love," he repeated. "Mademoiselle, if you wish my help, you must trust me. Who is this person?" Clara shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I can't. If I tell, it'll ruin them. Please, Monsieur Poirot, believe me, I didn't murder him." Poirot nodded, his expression grave. "I believe you are sincere, mademoiselle, but sincerity is not always truth. Rest now, and stay within. I will handle the village." As he left the cottage, Poirot's thoughts churned. The vicar's accusation had muddied the waters, but it had also revealed a pattern. Clara's confessions to Mrs. Langley and the vicar were consistent in their vagueness, as if rehearsed to protect another. The stopped clock, the letter opener, and Mrs. Granger's confession pointed to a deeper conspiracy, one the vicar might unwittingly or deliberately be part of. Back at the Blackthorn Inn, Poirot sat by the fire, his tisane steaming as he reflected. The veiled accusation had shifted the village's focus to Clara, but it had also exposed the vicar's own tensions with Hawthorne. Was Whitby a righteous man seeking justice, or a player in a larger game? Tomorrow, Poirot resolved, he would confront Dr. Pritchard about the medical report and seek out Edmund Hawthorne, whose absence from the village square during the vicar's outburst was conspicuously noted. For now, Poirot's little grey cells worked tirelessly, peeling back the layers of Thornwick's secrets, one veiled accusation. Chapter 7. The Hidden Correspondence. The dusk settled over Thornwick like a velvet curtain, casting long shadows across the village's cobbled lanes and lending an air of secrecy to its quiet corners. Hercule Poirot, seated in the dim parlour of the Blackthorn Inn, felt the weight of the case pressing upon him, each clue a thread in a tapestry that grew ever more intricate. The confessions of Clara Dunlay and Mrs. Grange, the stopped clock, the misplaced letter opener, and the vicar's public accusation had woven a complex web. But Poirot sensed that the heart of the mystery lay within Thornwick Manor itself. Tonight, with Mrs. Grange's reluctant permission, he had returned to the manor's study, determined to uncover what secrets Reginald Hawthorne had left behind. The study was as he had last seen it, a sombre chamber of oak and leather, its single window shuttered against the encroaching night. The air was heavy with the scent of old books and wax, and the desk, where Hawthorne had been found dead, loomed like an altar to unanswered questions. Poirot moved with the precision of a surgeon, his gloved hands sifting through the papers that cluttered the blotter. The letter-opener, now safely stored at the inn for further examination, had been a promising clue, but he sought something more, something that would illuminate the motives behind the confessions and the locked room enigma. His fingers paused on a leather-bound ledger, its edges worn from frequent handling. Tucked within its pages was a small bundle of letters, tied with a faded ribbon and hidden beneath a false flap in the binding. Poirot's moustache twitched with satisfaction. Such concealment was the mark of a man with secrets. He untied the ribbon and spread the letters on the desk, his green eyes scanning their contents with the intensity of a hawk. The letters, written in a precise, slanting hand, were addressed to Hawthorne, but bore no signature, only the cryptic initial S. Their tone was guarded, their language laced with veiled references that suggested both intimacy and urgency. One passage caught Poirot's attention. "The sparrow must fly before the storm breaks. Our arrangement cannot wait. Meet me at the usual place, 9 o'clock, and bring the agreed sum. Betray me, and all will be lost." Another letter, dated a week earlier, was even more enigmatic. "Your hesitation risks us both. The sparrow has kept your secrets, but loyalty has its price. Do not test my patience, or the truth will find its way to those who would use it against you." Poirot's mind raced. "The sparrow," he murmured, savouring the name. Was this a lover, a blackmailer, or a partner in some illicit venture? The reference to 9 o'clock aligned with the stopped grandfather clock, suggesting that the meeting had taken place, or been planned, on the night of Hawthorne's death. The mention of a sum and secrets hinted at financial or personal stakes, perhaps tied to the motives of the suspects he had already identified. He examined the letters further, noting their paper, fine, with a faint watermark, and the ink, a deep indigo that suggested expense. The absence of a full signature was deliberate, but the initial S was a clue in itself. Poirot recalled the villagers: Edmund Hawthorne, Clara Dunlay, Mrs. Grange, Harold Vickers, and the Reverend Whitby. None had a name beginning with S, but aliases were not uncommon, and the sparrow might be an outsider, a figure yet to emerge from the shadows. Determined to decode the letter's subtler meanings, Poirot turned to the desk's other contents. A small notebook, tucked in a drawer, contained cryptic notations, dates, sums, and abbreviations that matched the letter's tone. One entry, dated the day before Hawthorne's death, read, "S demands 500. Must settle or risk exposure." Exposure of what, Poirot wondered? An affair, a fraud, or something more sinister? As he worked, the manor's silence was broken by a soft creak from the corridor. Poirot froze, his senses alert. "Who is there?" he called, his voice sharp but calm. Mrs. Grange appeared in the doorway, her face pale in the lamplight. "Only me, Monsieur Poirot. I heard noises and thought, well, I thought you might need something." Poirot's eyes narrowed, though his smile was polite. "You are most attentive, madam. Tell me, did Monsieur Hawthorne ever speak of someone called the Sparrow?" Mrs. Granger's expression tightened, a flicker of fear crossing her features. "The Sparrow? No, never. He was a private man, kept his business to himself. I wouldn't know of such things." Poirot nodded, unconvinced. Her reaction betrayed knowledge, or at least suspicion. "And these letters," he said, holding up the bundle, "were they delivered to the manor, or did he collect them elsewhere?" Mrs. Grange hesitated. I saw him with letters sometimes brought by the post, but he burned most of them. I didn't ask questions." Poirot filed this away, noting her unease. Mrs. Granger's confession of poisoning Hawthorne had been too neat, and her presence now, so late, suggested she was watching him, or protecting something. He thanked her and resumed his work, but the encounter lingered in his mind. As he left the manor, the letters safely tucked in his coat, Poirot felt the case shifting beneath him, like a ship caught in a turning tide. The Sparrow was a new player, one whose identity could unlock the mystery of Hawthorne's death. The letters suggested a rendezvous that coincided with the stopped clock, and possibly with the argument Mary, the maid, had overheard. But how did this connect to Clara's vague confession, or Mrs. Granger's claim of poisoning? And was the Sparrow a victim, a conspirator, or the killer? Back at the Blackthorn Inn, Poirot spread the letters on his table, his tisane steaming as he pored over them. The coded language, the mention of secrets, the demand for money. These were pieces of a larger puzzle, one that pointed to a conspiracy beyond a simple murder. Tomorrow, he resolved, he would seek out Harold Vickers, the brewer, whose financial dispute with Hawthorne might tie to the sums mentioned in the letters. He would also press Clara for more details about her "someone I love," for her confession seemed increasingly like a shield for another. For now, Poirot leaned back, his eyes half closed as his little grey cells danced. The hidden correspondence had opened a new path, one fraught with danger and deception. The Sparrow, whoever they were, held the key to Thornwick's secrets, and Hercule Poirot was determined to find them before Chapter 8. The confession unravelled. The rain that had threatened Thornwick for days finally arrived, a soft but relentless drizzle that cloaked the village in a grey veil and turned its cobbled lanes to glistening mirrors. Hercule Poirot, sheltered beneath a sturdy umbrella, made his way to Clara Dunley's cottage, his mind as sharp as the point of his ebony cane. The coded letters, the stopped clock, the misplaced letter-opener, and the conflicting confessions of Clara and Mrs. Grange had woven a labyrinth of deceit, but Poirot sensed that Clara held a key to its heart. Her vague admissions, coupled with the vicar's public accusation, had painted her as a scapegoat, and Poirot was determined to uncover the truth she guarded so fiercely. The cottage door opened before he could knock, revealing Clara, her face pale and her eyes rimmed with the exhaustion of sleepless nights. She wore a shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders, as though warding off more than the autumn chill. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice a fragile thread, "I knew you'd come. The village, they're calling me a murderer. I can't bear it any longer." Poirot stepped inside, shaking the rain from his umbrella with a precise flick. "Mademoiselle Dunley," he said, his tone gentle but firm, The village speaks with the voice of fear, not reason. I, Hercule Poirot, seek only the truth. You have confessed to a terrible act, yet your words are shrouded in mystery. I ask you now, as one who wishes to help, what is it you hide? Clara sank into a chair, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her face. For a moment, silence hung heavy, broken only by the patter of rain against the windows. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. I lied, Monsieur Poirot. My confession, it wasn't true. I didn't do anything to Mr. Hawthorne. I said those things to protect someone else, someone who couldn't bear the shame. Poirot's green eyes gleamed, though his expression remained serene. To protect someone, he repeated, leaning forward. This is a grave matter, mademoiselle. Who is this person, and what did they do? Clara shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. I can't tell you. If I do, their life will be ruined. All I can say is that I saw something that night, something I wasn't meant to see. I thought if I took the blame, it would keep the truth from coming out. But now the vicar has made it worse, and I'm trapped. Poirot's mind raced. Clara's admission that her confession was false was a turning point. But her refusal to name the person she protected left the puzzle incomplete. You saw something, he said, his voice probing. Near the manor, oui? You claimed you found Monsieur Hawthorne dead. Tell me, what did you see, and when? Clara's hands twisted in her lap. It was after 9, maybe closer to 10. I went to the manor to confront Mr. Hawthorne about a wrong he'd done. But when I got there, I saw a man, a stranger, not from the village, slipping out of the back gate. He was tall, in a dark coat, and he moved like he didn't want to be seen. I was frightened, so I hid in the shadows. When I finally went inside, the study door was locked, and I couldn't get in. I assumed Mr. Hawthorne was already dead. Poirot's moustache twitched with interest. A mysterious stranger, seen near the time the grandfather clock stopped, was a new piece in the puzzle. It corroborated Mary the maid's account of a figure in a dark coat fleeing the manor. But it raised new questions. Was this stranger the Sparrow mentioned in the coded letters, or another player in Thornwick's drama? And why had Clara invented a confession to shield someone else? Mademoiselle, Poirot said, his tone softening, you have taken a great risk with this lie. If you will not name the person you protect, at least tell me this. What wrong had Monsieur Hawthorne done to prompt your visit? Clara's lips trembled, but she met his gaze. He was cruel, Monsieur Poirot. He used his power to hurt someone I care about, to threaten their future. I thought I could reason with him, make him stop. But I was too late. Poirot nodded, sensing the depth of her loyalty, though her vagueness frustrated him. Very well, mademoiselle. I will not press you further today, but know this. The truth, it cannot be hidden forever. If you trust Hercule Poirot, you will find a friend, not a foe. As he left the cottage, the rain drumming on his umbrella, Poirot's thoughts churned. Clara's unravelling confession suggested she was a pawn in a larger game, her lie designed to divert attention from the true culprit, or culprits. The stranger she described was a tantalizing clue, one that might connect to the Sparrow, or the argument overheard in the study. But her refusal to name the person she protected hinted at a personal connection. perhaps to Edmund Hawthorne, Harold Vickers, or even the vicar, each of whom had their own grievances against the dead man. Determined to pursue this new lead, Poirot made his way to the village inn, where he hoped to glean gossip about any strangers seen in Thornwick. The inn's tap-room was crowded with locals seeking refuge from the rain, their voices a low hum of speculation about Clara's guilt. Poirot approached the bar, where Mr. Tuttle, the innkeeper and husband of the postmistress, was polishing glasses with a distracted air. "Monsieur Tuttle," Poirot said, his voice cutting through the din, "I am told you see all who pass through Thornwick. Have you noticed a stranger in recent days? A tall man in a dark coat, perhaps lurking near the manor?" Mr. Tuttle's brow furrowed. "A stranger, you say? Well, there was a fellow a week or so back, stayed one night. Tall, kept his hat low, didn't talk much, paid in cash and was gone by morning. Didn't catch his name, but he asked about. The manor said he had business there. Odd sort, if you ask me." Poirot's pulse quickened. "And this was before or after Monsieur Hawthorne's death?" "The day before, I reckon," Tuttle replied. "Haven't seen him since." Poirot thanked him and retreated to his usual armchair by the fire, his tisane steaming as he reflected. The stranger's visit, so close to the night of the murder, was no coincidence. Was he the Sparrow, come to collect the sum mentioned in the letters? Or was he an agent of another, someone manipulating events from the shadows? The confessions, Clara's false one and Mrs. Grange's suspiciously precise one, now seemed part of a broader deception, designed to obscure the stranger's role. Tomorrow, Poirot resolved, he would revisit the coded letters, searching for clues to the stranger's identity. He would also confront Harold Vickers, whose financial dispute with Hawthorne might link to the sums mentioned in the correspondence. For now, he closed his eyes, letting his little grey cells sift through the unravelling threads. Clara's confession had begun to fray, revealing glimpses of the truth, but the mysterious stranger and the person she protected remained shrouded in mystery. Hercule Poirot, however, was not a man to be deterred. Chapter 9. The Garden of Secrets. The morning sun broke through the clouds over Thornwick, casting a tentative light on the village and revealing the sodden aftermath of the previous day's rain. Hercule Poirot, ever immaculate despite the damp, made his way to Thornwick Manor, his mind a whirl of clues and contradictions. Clara Dunlay's unravelling confession, the mysterious stranger in the dark coat, the coded letters signed by the Sparrow, and the stopped clock had deepened the mystery of Reginald Hawthorne's death. Today, Poirot's focus turned to the manor's neglected garden, prompted by a whispered rumour from the inn. A villager claimed to have seen a struggle there on the night of the murder, a detail that might illuminate the shadows of that fateful evening. The manor's garden was a wild tangle of overgrown roses, thorny brambles, and weeds that choked the once manicured paths. It stretched from the manor's rear to a copse of ancient oaks, its disorder a stark contrast to the rigid formality of the house. Poirot, his polished shoes carefully navigating the muddy ground, felt the garden's air of abandonment, as though it too harboured secrets too heavy to bear. Mrs. Grange had reluctantly agreed to his request to explore the grounds, though. Her pinched expression suggested she disapproved of his meddling. As he wandered, Poirot recalled the rumour, overheard at the Blackthorn Inn from a farmer named Mr. Cobb. Cobb, fortified by ale, had claimed to see two figures grappling near the garden's edge on the night Hawthorne died, their silhouettes blurred by dusk. Thought it was a lover's quarrel, Cobb had slurred, but it looked fierce, like one meant harm. The account was vague, but it aligned with Clara's sighting of a stranger, and Mary the maid's glimpse of a figure fleeing the manor. Poirot's little grey cells hummed with possibility. Had the garden witnessed a prelude to murder, or a separate drama altogether? He began his search near the back gate, where Clara had seen the stranger in the dark coat. The gate, rusted and half hidden by ivy, creaked as he pushed it open. The ground was soft from the rain, and Poirot's keen eyes spotted faint impressions in the mud. Footprints, perhaps, though too faded to discern their size or direction. He followed the path deeper into the garden, where a stone bench sat beneath a gnarled yew tree, its surface slick with moss. Here the earth was disturbed, as though recently trodden or dug. Poirot knelt, heedless of the mud on his trousers, and examined the soil. His fingers brushed against something hard and metallic, half buried beneath a tangle of roots. With care, he unearthed a small silver locket, its surface tarnished but intact. The locket was heart-shaped, engraved with delicate filigree, and a faint inscription was etched on its back. To E, forever yours. R. Poirot's pulse quickened. The initials, E and R, suggested a connection to Reginald Hawthorne. But who was E? Edmund, his estranged son, was a possibility. But the locket's design spoke of intimacy, not filial bonds. He opened the locket, revealing a faded photograph of a young woman, her features softened by time, but strikingly familiar. Poirot's memory, as sharp as a blade, recalled a face from the village. Mrs. Edith Grange, the housekeeper, though decades younger, her stern demeanour replaced by a wistful smile. The discovery was electrifying. Had Mrs. Grange and Hawthorne shared a romantic past, one that fuelled her bitterness and her confession of poisoning him? Or was the locket a relic of another relationship, buried to conceal a painful truth? Poirot pocketed the locket, intending to confront Mrs. Grange. But first he sought confirmation of the rumoured struggle. He made his way to the village, where Mr. Cobb, the farmer, was unloading cabbages at the market stall. Cobb, a ruddy-faced man with a perpetually squinting gaze, eyed Poirot warily as he approached. "Monsieur Cobb," Poirot said, his tone polished but direct, "I am Hercule Poirot, investigating the death of Monsieur Hawthorne. I understand you saw a struggle in the manor's garden on the night he died. Can you describe what you witnessed?" Cobb scratched his chin, his squint deepening. "Didn't think much of it at the time, sir. I was coming back from the pub, bit late, and saw two folk by the yew tree near the bench. One was tall, maybe a man, in a dark coat. The other was smaller, could have been a woman. They were tussling like, but it was dark, and I didn't linger. Thought it was none of my business." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And the time, monsieur? Can you recall it?" Cobb shrugged. "After 9, I'd say. The church bell had rung, but I wasn't counting." The timing aligned with the stopped clock, and Clara's sighting of the stranger, suggesting the garden struggle was a pivotal moment. Poirot thanked Cobb and returned to the manor, the locket a reassuring weight in his pocket. He found Mrs. Grange in the kitchen, her hands busy with a pile of linens, but her face etched with unease. "Madam," Poirot said, holding up the locket, "I found this in the garden, buried near the yew tree. The inscription suggests a connection to Monsieur Hawthorne. Can you explain?" Mrs. Grange's face paled, and her hands stilled. That's mine," she stammered, "from years ago, when I was young and foolish. Reginald gave it to me before he married another. I thought I'd lost it." Poirot's gaze was unrelenting. "And yet it was buried, as if to hide it. Tell me, madam, were you in the garden that night? Did you struggle with someone, perhaps the stranger Mademoiselle Dunley saw?" Mrs. Grange's eyes filled with tears. "No, Monsieur Poirot, I swear. I was in my room, as I told you. I haven't been in that garden in years. Someone must have taken the locket, buried it to make trouble." Poirot nodded, though his mind was far from settled. The locket tied Mrs. Grange to Hawthorne emotionally, lending credence to her confession of poisoning him out of resentment. But the buried locket and the witnessed struggle suggested another hand at work. Perhaps the sparrow or the mysterious stranger. Was Mrs. Grange a scorned lover, a conspirator, or a victim of manipulation? As he left the manor, Poirot's thoughts churned. The Garden of Secrets had yielded a clue that deepened the emotional stakes, linking past passions to present crimes. Tomorrow, he resolved, he would press Edmund Hawthorne about his father's relationships and revisit the coded letters for hints about the locket's significance. For now, he walked through the fading light, his little grey cells weaving the locket, the struggle and the confessions into a pattern that grew ever clearer. The truth, buried like the locket, was beginning to surface, and Hercule Poirot was determined. Chapter 10. The mirror of truth. The afternoon light filtered weakly through the clouds over Thornwick, casting a pallid glow that did little to warm the chill of suspicion that gripped the village. Hercule Poirot, his overcoat buttoned against, the damp approached Thornwick Manor with the air of a conductor preparing to lead a complex symphony. The clues, the coded letters, the stopped clock, the buried locket, and the conflicting confessions of Clara Dunley and Mrs. Grange had formed an intricate puzzle. But Poirot knew that the human heart, with its tells and tremors, often revealed what evidence alone could not. Today he would stage a gathering of suspects, not to accuse, but to observe, using the manor's mirrored drawing-room as his stage. The drawing-room, rarely used since Hawthorne's death, was a relic of grandeur. Days, its walls lined with tall mirrors that reflected every gesture and glance. The effect was disorienting, a kaleidoscope of truth and illusion, perfect for Poirot's purpose. He had requested Mrs. Grange to summon the key figures: Clara Dunley, Edmund Hawthorne, Harold Vickers, and the Reverend Thomas Whitby. Each had a motive, a secret or a connection to the mysterious sparrow, and Poirot intended to probe their reactions with questions designed to unsettle. As the suspects arrived, Poirot stood by the fireplace, his diminutive figure magnified by the mirrors into a dozen watchful reflections. Clara entered first, her face pale and her hands clutching her shawl, her eyes darting nervously to the mirrored walls. Edmund followed, his sullen demeanour barely masking a flicker of unease as he slouched into a chair. Vickers, the brewer, strode in with a scowl, his florid complexion betraying irritation. The vicar, Reverend Whitby, was last, his gaunt frame rigid with self-righteous calm, though his fingers twitched at his sides. Mrs. Grange lingered by the door, her expression a mix of reluctance and curiosity. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his voice smooth as velvet, "I have asked you here to discuss the death of Monsieur Reginald Hawthorne, a matter that has cast a shadow over Thornwick. I am Hercule Poirot, and I seek the truth, not through accusation, but through understanding. Let us speak plainly, for the mirrors around us reflect more than our faces, they reflect our hearts." The suspects shifted uncomfortably, their reflections multiplying their unease. Poirot turned to Clara first, his green eyes gentle but piercing. "Mademoiselle Donley, you have spoken of a terrible act, yet you say it was a lie to protect another. Can you tell us, in this room of truth, who you shield?" Clara's lips trembled, and her reflection showed her hands tightening on her shawl. I can't, Monsieur Poirot. It's too dangerous, but I swear I didn't kill him." Poirot noted the quiver in her voice, the way her eyes flicked toward Edmund, who sat stone-faced. He turned to Edmund next. "Monsieur Hawthorne, your father was a hard man, oui? You claim you were in London when he died, but the locket found in the garden, inscribed to an E, suggests a deeper connection. Was it yours, perhaps, or a token of your father's past?" Edmund's jaw tightened, and his reflection betrayed a clenched fist. "That locket's nothing to me," he snapped. "I told you I hadn't seen my father in years. You're barking up the wrong tree, Poirot." Poirot's moustache twitched, catching the defensive edge in Edmund's tone. He pivoted to Vickers. "Monsieur Vickers, your dispute with Monsieur Hawthorne Overland was bitter, and the coded letters speak of sums owed to a sparrow. Were you involved in a financial arrangement with him, one that turned deadly?" Vickers' face reddened, and his reflection showed a bead of sweat on his brow. "I don't know any sparrow," he growled. "Hawthorne cheated me, aye, but I was at my brewery that night. Ask my men." Poirot nodded, his gaze sliding to the vicar. "Monsieur Whitby, you accused Mademoiselle Dunley publicly, yet you had your own disagreements with Monsieur Hawthorne over church funds. Did your zeal for justice lead you to act, perhaps in the garden where a struggle was seen?" The vicar's eyes flashed, and his reflection revealed a momentary falter in his composure. "I acted in conscience," he said stiffly, "and I was at the vicarage all evening, praying for the village's soul. Your insinuations are baseless." Poirot paused, letting the silence stretch, the mirrors amplifying every fidget and glance. Mrs. Grange, still by the door, shifted her weight, her reflection showing a nervous twist of her apron. Poirot addressed her last. "Madame Grange, you confessed to poisoning Monsieur Hawthorne, yet the locket ties you to him romantically. Was your act born of love turned to hate, or do you too protect another?" Mrs. Grange's face crumpled, and her reflection caught a tear glistening in her eye. "I told you, it was me," she whispered. "I couldn't stand his cruelty. But the locket, it's from long ago. It means nothing now." The room was thick with tension, the mirrors reflecting a tableau of guarded expressions and subtle tells. Poirot's questions had been deliberately vague, designed to provoke reactions rather than confessions. Clara's glance at Edmund suggested a connection, perhaps the someone she protected. Edmund's defensiveness hinted at hidden knowledge, possibly about the locket. Vickers's sweat betrayed anxiety beyond mere anger, and the vicar's flash of temper suggested a personal stake. Mrs. Grange's tearful insistence on her guilt felt rehearsed, as if shielding another. Poirot clapped his hands, breaking the spell. "Merci, mes amis. You have been most illuminating. The truth, it is like a reflection, clear to those who know where to look. I will trouble you no further today." As the suspects filed out, their reflections lingering like ghosts, Poirot remained by the fireplace, his mind cataloguing the encounter. Clara's protectiveness, Edmund's evasion, Vicker's nervousness, Whitby's indignation, and Mrs. Grange's tears were clues in themselves, each a crack in the facade of their stories. The mirrors had done their work, amplifying the subtle cues that Poirot's little grey cells now sifted. Back at the Blackthorn Inn, Poirot sat by the fire, his tisane steaming as he reflected. The mirror of truth had revealed fissures in the suspect's defences, but the sparrow, the stranger in the dark coat, and the true nature of Hawthorne's death remained elusive. Tomorrow, he resolved, he would confront Dr. Pritchard about the medical reports' inconsistencies and press Vickers further about the financial sums in the letters. For now, he closed his eyes, letting the reflections of the drawing-room replay in his mind. The truth was near, shimmering like a mirrored image, and Hercule Poirot was determined. Chapter 11. The False Facade. The evening air in Thornwick carried a bite, as though the village itself braced for the unravelling of its secrets. Hercule Poirot, seated in the quiet parlour of the Blackthorn Inn, felt the weight of the case pressing ever closer to its resolution. The coded letters, the stopped clock, the buried locket, the mysterious stranger, and the mirrored confrontation had illuminated fragments of the truth. But the confessions of Clara Dunlay, Mrs. Grange, and the motives of the other suspects remained a tangled knot. Poirot's little grey cells hummed with anticipation, for he sensed that the next revelation would crack the facade of lies that shrouded Reginald Hawthorne's death. His musings were interrupted by a sharp knock at the inn's door, followed by the hurried entrance of Edmund Hawthorne, the late landowner's estranged son. Edmund's face was flushed, his eyes wild with a mix of defiance and desperation. His coat was askew, as though he had run through the village's darkening lanes to reach Poirot. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice hoarse, "I need to speak with you. Alone. It's about my father." Poirot gestured to a chair, his expression serene, but his eyes sharp as a blade. "Monsieur Hawthorne, you are most welcome. Sit and tell me what troubles you. The hour is late, and such urgency suggests a matter of gravity." Edmund collapsed into the chair, his hands gripping its arms. "I can't keep it in any longer," he said, his words tumbling out. "It was me. I killed my father. I didn't mean to, but we argued that night, and things got out of hand. I struck him and he fell. When I left, he was dead." Poirot's moustache twitched, though his composure remained unshaken. A third confession, following Clara's false admission and Mrs. Grange's claim of poisoning, was a development that both clarified and confounded. "Mon Dieu," he said, leaning forward. "This is a serious claim, monsieur. Tell me precisely what happened. Where did this argument take place, and when?" Edmund's gaze dropped to the floor, his fingers twisting together. It was in the study, just after 9. I'd come to confront him about money, my inheritance, which he'd cut off years ago. He laughed at me, called me a failure. I lost my temper and hit him with the letter opener. He collapsed and I panicked. I locked the door and fled through the garden. Poirot's mind raced, cataloguing the inconsistencies. The letter opener, which he had found buried under papers, bore no bloodstains, and Dr. Pritchard's report, however cursory, had noted no wounds. The stopped clock at 10 minutes past 9 aligned with Edmund's timeline. But Mrs. Grange had found Hawthorne dead hours later, with the door locked from the inside. And Clara's claim of seeing a stranger at the back gate suggested another presence. Edmund's story, like the others, was plausible but riddled with holes. "You struck him with the letter opener," Poirot repeated, his tone probing, and yet the body showed no such injury. "How do you explain this, monsieur?" Edmund's face paled, and he stammered, I must have been mistaken. Maybe I didn't hit him hard, but he was dead, I'm sure of it. I felt his pulse. Nothing." Poirot's eyes narrowed. The confession was too convenient, too aligned with the clues, yet it contradicted the physical evidence. He leaned back, his fingers steepled. "Monsieur, you are not the first to confess to this crime. Mademoiselle Dunley claimed a terrible act, later admitting it was a lie to protect another. Madame Grange swore she poisoned Monsieur Hawthorne. And now you, with a tale of violence that does not fit the facts. Tell me, why do you confess? Now?" Edmund's shoulders slumped, and his voice dropped to a whisper. "Because Clara's suffering. The village is tearing her apart, and I can't let her take the blame. I thought if I came forward, it would end." Poirot's pulse quickened. The mention of Clara suggested a connection, perhaps the someone she protected. But the pattern of confessions, each vague, each conflicting, pointed to a deeper truth. They were not independent acts of guilt, but a coordinated effort to obscure the real crime. "Monsieur," Poirot said, his voice firm, "I believe you, like Mademoiselle Dunley, seek to shield another. These confessions, they are a facade built to hide the hand that struck the fatal blow. Who do you protect?" Edmund's eyes flickered with fear, but he shook his head. "No one. It's just me. Leave Clara out of this, Poirot." Poirot rose, his diminutive figure commanding the room. "Very well, monsieur. I will not press you tonight, but know this. The truth, it cannot be buried by lies, no matter how noble their intent. Go now, and reflect on what you have said." As Edmund stumbled out into the night, Poirot returned to his chair, his tisane cooling as his mind churned. 3 confessions, each a false facade, suggested a conspiracy, a group effort to protect the true killer or to mask a different crime altogether. The coded letters, with their mention of the sparrow and sums owed, hinted at a financial or personal betrayal that might have driven the murder. The locket, tying Mrs. Grange to Hawthorne's past, suggested old wounds that could motivate such a cover-up, and the stranger in the dark coat, seen by Clara and the maid, was a wild card, possibly the sparrow or an agent of another. Poirot's thoughts turned to the physical clues. The stopped clock, marking a critical moment. The letter opener, misplaced, but unblooded. The residue in the teacup, hinting at poison. Each confession had been crafted to fit these clues, yet none fully explained them. The locked study, with its undisturbed appearance, suggested a staged scene, perhaps to make the death appear natural. The absence of an autopsy, rushed by Dr. Pritchard, was a glaring oversight that Poirot now suspected was deliberate. Tomorrow, he resolved he would confront Dr. Pritchard directly, demanding access to any notes or observations from the examination. He would also revisit the coded letters, searching for a link to Edmund's sudden confession. The false facade was crumbling, and Poirot sensed the truth lurking just beyond its cracks. For now, he sat by the fire, his little grey cells weaving the confessions, clues, and contradictions into a pattern that grew ever clearer. The conspiracy was unravelling, and Hercule Poirot was poised to expose the hand that had... Chapter 12. The sparrow's flight the dawn broke over Thornwick with a tentative glow, as though the village held its breath, awaiting the revelation of its deepest secrets. Hercule Poirot, standing at the window of his room at the Blackthorn Inn, gazed out at the mist-shrouded lanes, his mind a crucible of clarity. The false confessions of Clara Dunlay, Mrs. Grange, and Edmund Hawthorne had formed a deliberate smokescreen, but the coded letters, the stopped clock, the buried locket, and the mysterious stranger had pointed Poirot toward a singular figure. The Sparrow. Today he would unmask this elusive player and trace their role in Reginald Hawthorne's death, a pursuit that promised to unravel the conspiracy at the heart of the case. Poirot's morning began with a return to the coded letters, spread across his table like a map to the truth. The letters, signed with the initial S, spoke of sums owed, secrets kept, and a meeting at 9 o'clock, the precise time the grandfather clock had stopped. The handwriting, precise and slanting, had nagged at Poirot's memory, and a sudden recollection from his mirrored confrontation in the drawing-room brought clarity. The Reverend Thomas Whitby, the vicar, had handed him a church pamphlet during their encounter, its text written in a hand strikingly similar to the letters. Could Whitby, with his righteous facade and tension with Hawthorne, be the Sparrow? Determined to test this hypothesis, Poirot made his way to the vicarage, a modest stone building beside the church. The vicar was in his study, sorting hymnals, but his composure faltered as Poirot entered, his green eyes sharp with purpose. "Monsieur Whitby," Poirot said, his voice deceptively mild, "I have a question most pressing. You are familiar, perhaps, with a certain Sparrow who corresponded with Monsieur Hawthorne?" Whitby's hands froze, and a flush crept into his gaunt cheeks. "The Sparrow? I know nothing of such a name, Monsieur Poirot. Your accusations grow tiresome." Poirot produced one of the letters, holding it up like a talisman. "This letter, monsieur, bears a hand much like your own. It speaks of secrets and sums, of a meeting at 9 o'clock on the night Monsieur Hawthorne died. I put it to you that you are the Sparrow, and that your dealings with Hawthorne led to his demise." Whitby's eyes darted to the letter, and, for a moment, Poirot thought he might bolt. Instead, the vicar sank into a chair, his shoulders slumping. "You are relentless, Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice low. "Very well, I am the Sparrow, but I did not kill him. Our arrangement was delicate, but not deadly." Poirot leaned forward, his moustache twitching with anticipation. "Explain, monsieur. What was this arrangement?" Whitby sighed, his fingers tracing the edge of his desk. Hawthorne was a man of secrets, as you've guessed. Years ago, he swindled funds from the church, funds meant for the poor. I discovered it, but he paid me to keep silent, small sums at first, then larger. I used the money for the church roof, telling myself it was justified. The letters were my way of pressing him, using the name Sparrow to protect myself. That night, I went to the manor to demand a final payment, but he refused. We argued, and I left him alive, I swear. Poirot's mind raced, fitting Whitby's confession into the puzzle. The argument aligned with Mary the maid's account of voices in the study, and the 9 o'clock meeting matched the stopped clock. But Whitby's claim of leaving Hawthorne alive contradicted the timeline, unless another had intervened. And this argument, Poirot pressed, it took place in the study. Did you see anyone else, a stranger perhaps, or Mademoiselle Dunlay? Whitby shook his head. No one. But as I left through the garden, I felt watched. I hurried away, fearing Hawthorne would expose me. Poirot's pulse quickened. The garden, where a struggle had been witnessed, was a nexus of the crime. Whitby's role as the Sparrow explained the letters and the financial motive, but his denial of murder rang true, his fear genuine. The chase for the truth now turned metaphorical, a pursuit through the labyrinth of lies to find the hand that had struck the fatal blow. Leaving the vicarage, Poirot sought out Dr. Pritchard, whose cursory medical report had long troubled him. The doctor, a nervous man with a penchant for avoiding eye contact, was at his surgery, sorting bottles of laudanum. "Monsieur Pritchard," Poirot said, his tone firm, "your report on Monsieur Hawthorne's death was incomplete. No autopsy, no tests for poison. I suspect you were persuaded to overlook certain details." "By whom?" Pritchard's hands trembled, and he stammered, I did my duty, Monsieur Poirot. His heart failed, that's all. No one asked me to—" "Enough," Poirot interrupted, his voice cutting like a blade. "You were seen speaking with Monsieur Vickers the day after the death, in hushed tones. Was it he who urged you to close the case quickly?" Pritchard's face crumpled. "Vickers. He said it was for the village's good, to avoid scandal. He offered to pay my debts if I declared it natural. I didn't know there was poison, I swear." The revelation was a thunderbolt. Harold Vickers, the brewer, had manipulated the investigation, suggesting a deeper involvement. Poirot's chase now led to Vickers, whose financial dispute with Hawthorne and nervous demeanour in the mirrored room hinted at guilt. He found Vickers at his brewery, the air thick with the scent of malt. The brewer's florid face paled as Poirot approached, the letter-opener, clean but symbolically damning, in his hand. "Monsieur Vickers," Poirot said, his eyes unrelenting, "you bribed Dr. Pritchard to conceal the truth of Hawthorne's death. The letters speak of sums owed to the Sparrow, but I suspect you too had dealings with Hawthorne, dealings that ended in murder." Vickers backed away, his hands raised. "I didn't kill him. Yes, I paid Pritchard, but only to keep things quiet. Hawthorne cheated me, and I wanted his death swept under the rug, not investigated. I was at the brewery that night. Ask anyone." Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "Your alibi, it is too perfect, monsieur. And the stranger seen fleeing the manor. Perhaps he was your agent, sent to settle the score." Vickers's denial was vehement, but Poirot saw the fear in his eyes. The chase was closing in, the sparrow's flight leading to a truth that tied the confessions, the clues, and the conspiracy together. The locket, the stopped clock, the residue in the teacup, all pointed to a staged death, orchestrated to protect the true killer. Clara's false confession, Mrs. Granger's emotional claim, and Edmund's desperate admission were shields for another. But the stranger and vicar's bribery suggested a coordinated effort. Back at the inn, Poirot sat by the fire, his tisane steaming as he pieced the final threads together. The sparrow's identity was unmasked, but the killer remained elusive, hidden behind the false confessions. Tomorrow, in the manor's drawing-room, Poirot would gather the suspects for a final reckoning, exposing the truth in a denouement worthy of his little grey cells. For now, he closed his eyes, the chase complete, the sparrow's flight ended, and the truth hovering just. Chapter 13. The Order of the Little Grey Cells. The drawing-room of Thornwick Manor was steeped in an expectant hush, its mirrored walls reflecting the flickering light of a single chandelier. The air was heavy with the scent of wax and anticipation, as though the room itself awaited the unveiling of its secrets. Hercule Poirot stood at the centre, his diminutive figure commanding the space, his moustache impeccably waxed, and his green eyes gleaming with the certainty of truth. Around him sat the suspects, Clara Dunley, pale and trembling, Mrs. Edith Grange, her face etched with weary guilt, Edmund Hawthorne, sullen and defiant, Harold Vickers, sweating despite the chill, and the Reverend Thomas Whitby, rigid with self-righteous calm. The village doctor, Dr. Pritchard, hovered near the door, his nervous fidgeting a stark contrast to Poirot's serene composure. Mes amis, Poirot began, his voice a velvet blade cutting through the tension. We are gathered to lay bare the truth of Monsieur Reginald Hawthorne's death, a crime cloaked in a web of lies, false confessions, and hidden motives. You have each played a part, but only one struck the fatal blow. Hercule Poirot, with the order of his little grey cells, will now reveal the murderer. The suspects shifted, their reflections multiplying their unease in the mirrors. Poirot paced slowly, his cane tapping a deliberate rhythm. From the beginning, this case was a puzzle of contradictions. 3 confessions, those of Mademoiselle Dunley, Madame Grange, and Monsieur Edmund, each claiming responsibility for a death declared natural. A locked study, a stopped clock, a misplaced letter opener, a buried locket, and coded letters signed The Sparrow. These clues, they seemed to point in many directions, but to Poirot they told a single story. He turned to Clara first, his gaze softening. Mademoiselle Dunley, your confession was the spark that ignited my curiosity. You spoke of a terrible act, but later admitted it was a lie to protect another. Your fear, your tears, they were genuine, but your words shielded someone dear. Who was it, I asked? The answer lay in your glances, your loyalty to Monsieur Edmund, your former betrothed. Clara gasped, her hands clutching her shawl, but Poirot continued, pivoting to Edmund. Monsieur Hawthorne, you confessed to striking your father with the letter opener, a tale that crumbled under scrutiny, for the opener was clean and no wounds were found. Like Mademoiselle Dunley, you sought to protect, but your story was a facade built to divert suspicion. Edmund's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, Poirot's gaze shifted to Mrs. Grange. "Madame Grange, your confession of poisoning Monsieur Hawthorne was heartfelt, tied to a locket that revealed your past love for him. Yet the residue in the teacup was not poison, but a sedative, harmless in itself. Your guilt was real, but your crime was imagined, a shield for another." Mrs. Grange's eyes filled with tears, and Poirot turned to Whitby. "Monsieur Whitby, you were the sparrow, extorting Hawthorne to fund your church, as your letters revealed. Your argument with him at 9 o'clock, when the clock stopped, placed you at the scene. But you left him alive. Your fear of exposure, driving your public accusation of Mademoiselle Dunlay." Whitby's face paled, his hands gripping his chair. Poirot's attention moved to Vickers. "Monsieur Vickers, your bribery of Dr. Pritchard to declare the death natural suggested guilt, yet your alibi was airtight. You sought to bury the scandal, but not because you killed. You feared the truth would ruin you financially." Finally, Poirot addressed Dr. Pritchard. "Monsieur Pritchard, your cursory report was a grave error, bought by Vickers' coin, but it was not you who killed, only you who enabled the lie." The room was taut with anticipation, the mirrors reflecting a tableau of strained faces. Poirot paused, his voice rising with dramatic flair. The confessions, they were a symphony of deception, orchestrated to protect the true murderer. But the clues, the stopped clock, the locket, the letters, pointed to one truth. Monsieur Hawthorne was not killed by poison, nor by a blow, but by a subtler means, suffocation, staged to appear as heart failure. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Poirot continued, his logic unassailable. The stopped clock marked the moment of death, 10 minutes past 9, after the sparrow's argument. The letter opener, misplaced, was a distraction. Its smudge a trace of wax, not blood. The locket, buried in the garden, was a relic of love turned to hate, but not the motive. The stranger in the dark coat, seen by Mademoiselle Dunlay and the maid, was no stranger at all, but a figure known to us. Poirot's gaze settled on Mrs. Grange, whose tears had ceased, replaced by a frozen dread. "Madame Grange, it was you who killed Monsieur Hawthorne. Your love for him, long soured by his cruelty, turned to rage when he threatened to expose your past to the village, ruining your reputation. That night, after the sparrow left, you entered the study, using your spare key. You confronted him, and in a moment of passion, you smothered him with a cushion, his weak heart masking the act. You locked the door from the inside, exiting through the window, which you closed behind you, creating the illusion of a sealed room." Mrs. Grange's face crumpled, a sob escaping her lips. "I didn't mean to," she whispered. "He laughed at me, said he'd tell everyone about us. I couldn't let him destroy me." Poirot's voice softened, but his resolve was iron. "The confessions were your doing, were they not? You confided in Mademoiselle Dunlay, your niece, who lied to protect you. You persuaded Monsieur Edmond, her former love, to confess, knowing his loyalty to Clara would compel him. Your own confession was a half-truth, designed to muddy the waters. The village, with its gossip, became your shield." Clara's eyes widened, and Edmund reached for her hand, his defiance melting into guilt. Whitby and Vickers exchanged glances, their own secrets exposed, but their roles secondary. Dr. Pritchard hung his head, shamed by his complicity. Poirot clapped his hands, breaking the spell. The truth, mes amis, is restored. Madame Grange, you will face justice, but your heart, it has spoken. The order of the little grey cells has prevailed. As the constable was summoned and Mrs. Grange led away, the room emptied, leaving Poirot alone with his reflections. The mirrors showed a man small in stature but vast in intellect, a guardian of truth in a world of lies. He thought of Thornwick, forever changed by the case, and of human nature, with its capacity for love, betrayal, and redemption. Later, at the Blackthorn Inn, Poirot sipped his tisane, his holiday abandoned, but his purpose fulfilled. The case of the confession that lied had tested his little grey cells, but they had not failed. As he prepared to leave Thornwick, he mused on the fragility of secrets and the strength of truth, a balance he had restored, as only Hercule